Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is praising what he calls a productive conversation with President Trump. This was during their meeting on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly. And Zelenskyy spoke before the UN General Assembly in New York today. During his remarks, he said the global response to the war was not enough, and that, quote, no one can feel safe as Russia ramps up its actions in the region. And he also called on the UN to work together in an effort to put an end to Russia's aggression.
Stopping Russia now is cheaper than wondering who will be the first to create a simple drone carrying a nuclear warhead. So we must use everything we have together to force the aggressor to stop. And only then do we have a real chance that this arms race will not end in catastrophe for all of us.
And CBS News White House reporter Olivia Rinaldi joins us now. Olivia, very good to see you here. The president expressing there his support for Ukraine, saying the country could possibly regain all of the territory that was captured by Russia. Big about face on that. After this latest meeting, how aligned are he and President Zelenskyy on their practical goals for Ukraine, as well as for the overall trajectory of this war?
Well, Nancy, it seems like they're aligned more now than ever, the two leaders. Of course, when President Trump came into office, he said he was going to use his close relationship with President Putin to get an end to this war. Now, over the course of 9 months, President Trump and President Zelenskyy, who have met numerous times, had numerous phone calls, seem that they are in lockstep about what needs to be done to end this war. Now, that is not where President Trump was previously, where he said that the lines of where the war is right now, with Russia having about 20% or so of Ukrainian territory under their control, needs to be frozen that way. Now the president on social media yesterday says, after getting to know and fully understand the situation in Ukraine and after seeing the economic trouble it's causing Russia, he wrote, I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back to its original form. And that's the part that is the most important there, is the help with the support of the European Union, because we know that the president has said that it's really up to Europe to help Ukraine in their quest to fight off Russia, and that the U.S. is providing new weapons, but that is through a program that they have set up through NATO, where they will give the weapons to NATO, but the European Union and European countries will essentially buy those weapons and then give them to Ukraine to help aid in this fight. But now the president seeming to do a little bit of an about-face, departure from his previous statements, that he now is fully in support of Ukraine going after that territory that they have lost and trying to regain that, with the simple question that he also wrote on social media of why not? With the time and patience and financial support of Europe, the borders can get back to where they were before the war started. So seeming of a change from the president, who also called Russia a paper tiger. Nancy, there was a lot to unpack in that social media post.
Yes.
As I keep looking back and reflecting on it, I was like, oh yeah, there's another point I want to make, that he called Russia a paper tiger. So quite a notable post from President Trump yesterday about the situation in Ukraine.
Yeah, very interesting shifts. It turns out anything can happen during UN General Assembly week. But Olivia, on another note, I want to ask you about here, the Trump administration now rehiring hundreds of federal employees who were laid off as part of the DOGE cuts, of course, earlier this year. What more do we know about that decision, and when are those employees expected to return to work?
Yeah, so this was a letter that was sent from the General Services Administration to employees who had either voluntarily left or been fired by DOGE. They're asking them to come back and decide by the end of the week whether they accept or decline to be reinstated. Now, the General Services Administration handles just a lot of administrative work here in Washington. There are about 12,000 employees. Hundreds of them were let go as DOGE sought to root out waste, fraud, and abuse in the government. They're now asking them to come back, and in a statement they wrote to us that after a comprehensive consideration of the workforce actions, they're making adjustments in the best interest of the agencies and the American taxpayers in which they serve. Nancy?
All right, Olivia Rinaldi covering it all for us. We appreciate your time.